Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Jake Garber, and I'm joining you all from my home in London, in the UK. Today, I have the huge pleasure of welcoming you all to what is sure to be a thought-provoking conversation with Geoff Mulgan and Paul Kissack on collective imagination in spaces of institutional power. This event is being hosted by the Collective Imagination Practice Community. The community is stewarded by Huddlecraft and my organisation Canopy, and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The community is part of wider efforts to create the conditions for the work of collective imagination to contribute to transformations of society that are desperately needed. As part of this community, we're hosting a series of talks like these, curating 3-month peer-led learning journeys, and we have a small grants fund to support people who want to carry out experiments in collective imagination. Those might be things you're interested in. So if you'd like to join us and know more, we'll put the link in the chat now. Today, we'll be having a conversation for about an hour and making space for a few audience questions towards the end of that time. After that hour is finished, I know our speakers have got things that they need to go to straight after that, and we'll say goodbye to them and thank you. And if you'd like to join us for an extra half an hour in breakout rooms, we'll have space for discussion of what we've heard and what it means to each of our work. You'd be most welcome to join us for that. So to introduce the topic, we're in a polycrisis, crisis of inequality, exploitation, extraction, climate breakdown, austerity, to name just a few of the elements. There is such a powerful case that we need to be reimagining some of the fundamentals of society: care, relationship to the environment, housing, economics, right through to institutions and governments themselves. But too often the responses that we hear about are framed by the same imaginary or way of thinking that created the problem, and our solutions simply maintain the deeper structural problems. Many in this community are hoping for responses that go beyond reform, even beyond radical, to possibilities that we can't even see yet. And the journey there can only be emergent and uncertain. Many of you in this community work in government and public services, working hard to make things better. You may feel instinctively that more of the same isn't going to cut it. Maybe you feel frustrated, heartbroken even, by the limitations. Everybody is welcome here, and none of us have the answers. This community aims to be a place for this coming together. In this talk, we've got 3 people, including me, who've benefited from multiple systemic advantages. We can't see the whole picture as clearly as some of you might. What Geoff and Paul do bring is a deep knowledge of government, a genuine hope and imagination, and a critical perspective. So given that today we're exploring the edge where collective imagination meets institutional power and culture, we're delighted to be joined by 2 people who straddle those 2 worlds. Paul Kissack and Geoff Mulgan, 2 people with massive CVs. So let me have a quick go at introducing you to them. Paul Kissack is the Chief Executive of Joseph Rowntree Foundation. He's also worked at the heart of government in the UK and in New Zealand. Paul was the Director General working on the UK response to COVID-19 and Director General in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the Department for Education. In New Zealand, he was Deputy Chief Executive at the Ministry for Children. Paul has also held senior roles at the Treasury, the Cabinet Office and in local government. He's worked throughout his career on economic and social policy issues and public service reform. At JRF, Paul is now supporting the ambitious Emerging Futures programme, of which this is part. Geoff Mulgan is Professor of Collective Intelligence, Public Policy and Social Innovation at University College London. Before that, he was Chief Executive of Nesta, the UK's Innovation Foundation. Geoff had roles in the UK government, including Director of Government Strategy Unit and Head of Policy in the Prime Minister's Office. Geoff has had a role in founding a host of organisations, including Demos and the Young Foundation. Geoff has advised many governments around the world and currently chairs a European Commission programme on whole of government innovation. 2 very relevant books of Geoff's to our conversation today. Another World is Possible explores the urgent need for social imagination, and Profits at a Tangent explores the role of visionary artists in social change. So welcome, Paul, and welcome, Geoff. It's great to have you both here. And Hannah, perhaps we could pin the speakers so that everybody can see them well. Thank you. So in terms of the conversation, I'll ask a few questions to get us going, but Paul and Geoff, feel free to ask each other questions. We'll have a bit of a shared conversation today. So given the subject is around sort of collective imagination in these different spaces, everybody's got a slightly different take on what do we mean by collective imagination, social imagination. Just like to invite you both to start by saying, well, what does it mean to you and why do you think it's important? And Geoff, Paul, either of you feel free to jump in first.
Are you going to me? I don't really like. Okay. So I assume everyone on this call's kind of signed up to the idea that this stuff matters. That, you know, just as in our own lives, if you don't have some sense of where you want to get to, some imagination at a personal level, then, you know, life isn't great. And for any kind of group, a community, an organization, a city, a society, it's equally important to have some sense of your direction, your roadmaps, your pathways of how things could be better. We'll come perhaps later on to why this seems to be difficult at the moment. You've already said some of the reasons, Jake. I guess the two or three things I'm really keen we can explore with all of you today. One is with the hard work of turning the germs of imagination, the fragments, into something more meaningful, more developed. And for that, I see there's a real parallel in the arts. When, let's say, making a film, you can have a brilliant idea for a film, but turning it into 90 minutes, which lots of people will want to watch and get a lot out of, it's an incredibly hard work and involves lots of different skill sets. The second part of the hardness is, which we will focus on, is then landing it in power, people with the capacity to act, which may be a national government, a city, but also NGOs and businesses and arts organizations. We'll dive into that. And thirdly, I think crucially, how do you share those visions, that imagination, not just with people who agree with you or have sort of similar lives, but people who maybe start from very different premises, view the world through very different eyes. And this seems to me at the moment critically important because we have a society so divided into different bubbles, echo chambers, and so on, that a genuinely inclusive collective imagination feels harder now, perhaps, than 10, 20, 30 years ago. And of course, finally, I mean, this all matters because if you don't have some shared sense of the possible, you drift into this sort of negative, pessimistic fatalism, which all of us see around us. The sense everything's getting worse, nothing can be done, the system is so big, so monstrous that you might as well give up and just, I don't know, have fun, look after your garden or something like that. So that's our risk at the moment. There's so many, I think, well-intentioned people are almost pulling away from the possibility of imagination because it just seems so difficult. That was a bit negative. Sorry, Paul. Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, I actually, the idea of having fun and looking after your garden is something I would wholeheartedly endorse, but not if it was as an alternative to the work of trying to create a better society. So, I agree very much with what Geoff set out there, including the challenges that we face around collective imagination. I think for me, the personal motivation is, you know, as you're setting out, I spent about 20 years working in central government primarily. And central government is a sort of great place to see, to some degree, the scale of the challenges you're facing. You know, government is very naturally focuses into what is going wrong, what the scale of the challenge is, but felt to me a place where there was a lack of belief, actually, and a lack of collective imagination, and some of the sort of stupor and the fatalism that Geoff was alluding to, I think, is definitely there at the heart of government, despite the sort of almost overly exuberant sense of we are going to be world beating, we are going to achieve this, we're going to achieve that, you know, government by prophets who can sort of, you know, paint the beautiful picture of what the future could look like. But underpinning it, a sense, I think, within lots of people working in government or around government, with government in partnership, where that sort of belief was lacking. And actually, I think part of my experience in government was I assumed that the longer I stayed there and perhaps the more senior I got, the more hopeful I would be and the more I'd feel empowered to do things differently. And actually, what I experienced, it almost doesn't matter where in government you happen to be or what level you are, you sort of feel powerless. And that sort of concept of powerlessness sits for me alongside the sort of fatalism that Geoff was talking about, and as a worrying thing, you know, because we have to push beyond fatalism and beyond the sense of individual and collective powerlessness if we are going to address some of the huge challenges that you were alluding to. And so that's what draws my interest into the concept of collective imagination, that need to see the world differently and set a direction. I like Geoff's phrase about setting a direction, and that is different, I think, from setting the destination or the blueprint or drawing up the utopia. It is something about getting energy and momentum behind a particular sense of direction, and that belief you can move in a particular direction. And it is more than just ideas. There are lots of ideas around, but, you know, sometimes felt that, you know, government was where ideas go to die. And that shouldn't be the case. But if it's not going to be the case, it has to be a collective endeavor.
Yeah, thank you. I feel there's so much in what you both just said. I actually kind of want to pick up, Paul, you used the word powerless, and I think lots of people in this community here because there's that potential to feel powerless in the face of all of this, and yet we want to take action, we want to be hopeful, and we want to kind of multiply what's possible, not just choose from the options that are set out ahead of us. And I was just going for a walk actually, and I was seeing sort of heavy sort of paving slabs, and sometimes it feels like when we're trying to do this work that what we're trying to work with is impermeable, it's heavy, it sits on top, but then there's also certain kind of seedlings kind of breaking through the cracks. And yeah, I wondered if you would both like to talk to obviously there's the sort of the culture that makes it difficult to land this kind of work, but also where you see the opportunities, whether that's in frames and narratives or programs where you think actually there are the sort of a little bit of a space for a seed of collective imagination, or something that you see hope in terms of the environment for collective imagination.
Well, maybe a couple of comments on that. I think it's very important that this kind of community has a sense of what has actually changed in the last 30, 50, 100 years. And I started life as very much an activist. And if you're an activist, you always want to emphasize how bad things are. But that can overshoot, because that can make people lose sight of positive change. So I sometimes ask a group like this, and it may be unfair to do so, you know, what's happened to carbon emissions in this country in this century, let's say, since the year 2000? And I assume all of you know, because you care about climate change. Would anyone want to shout out what has happened to carbon emissions in the UK in the last, you know, this century, since the year 2000? Have they gone up? Have they gone down? Are they flat? Duncan says gone up. They've gone down about 50%, even if you include imports. Now, that's the result of a huge amount of work done by lots of scientists and engineers and activists and so on back in the 80s and 90s, which led to all sorts of things from, you know, wind power to changing building standards. The whole world has a hell of a long way to go to cut carbon emissions globally. But if we don't bank some of, you know, what has been achieved on the most important issue of our time, we end up with an unrealistic fatalism. The same is true of shifting common sense. And this is where, again, a community like this, I think, has huge potential power. Look back over the last 30 or 40 years at things which have just changed our common sense. A hell of a lot in relation to sexuality or gender, a hell of a lot in relation to waste. I started my career working on recycling. In Europe now, about 80% of paper is recycled, about 70% of glass. We look at waste in a completely different way from our predecessors, our ancestors, even though, again, there's a long way to go. Or disability and disability rights, a complete transformation of common sense. And it's really important we celebrate those changes. They always take quite a long time, but if we don't, then lots of people just think, blimey, there's nothing we can do. As you say, Jake, it's all so intractable, so difficult. Veganism is a great example, founded by a man in Scotland back in the 1940s, a tiny little movement back then. But now I would guess probably quite a lot of you are vegan. It's rising to 10%, certainly in big cities, and is on its way to becoming mainstream. So really important that we, in a sense, recognize actually how much does change, but nearly always we risk either overestimating how much can change short term, but then underestimating how much can change long term, or, as in the case of carbon, not even being aware of what the long-term direction of the facts is. Hannah Ritchie, I don't know if any of you read her book out a month or two ago, who's from Our World in Data. It's a really good book to read. It just puts the facts, together on extreme poverty, on inequality, on climate, on waste, and so on. And it's it's a complicated picture, but it's one we need to know. Otherwise, we, as I say, we overshoot into an almost unrealistic negativity and fatalism.
Yeah, I'm just to emphasize that, because the time periods are really important, I think, in this conversation, and trying to find the optimal time period, as it were, to maximize your sense of agency feels really important. And I sometimes wonder whether that is about 20 years, because 20 years is a sort of period of time that people can kind of get their head around. For me, 20 years is that's the sort of period of time I've been working in public policy. And if I was to go back and do the sort of exercise Geoff's suggesting there, what has shifted in 20 years? Actually, things have shifted enormously in 20 years. Now, I would sort of argue that quite a bit has shifted in the wrong direction, actually, as well. So, I mean, if you were to pick out other things like the scale of deep poverty in the UK, that has been going up for about 20 years. The home ownership crisis has been a problem for about 20 years. But then you point to other aspects like carbon emissions, and what you realize is these things, they can go in either direction. And the fact that they can go in either direction shows that there are choices to be made there. And I mean, Geoff mentions this in his book, but it's one of those things you hear quite a lot about governments underestimating the difference you can make in 10 years or 20 years, and then overstating the difference they can make in a few. And so what we do is we overstate what we can achieve. We then fail to achieve it in the short term, and that reinforces a sense of fatalism. Whereas actually, if we have a way of looking out across those longer periods of time, and say 20 years is more appealing to me than 10 in some respects. It's hard to make that case when the world is on fire and people sort of think, well, we haven't got 20 years. But actually, it is remarkable what can shift in 20 years. And that is a meaningful period of time for most of us in terms of thinking about what we want to commit ourselves to in public policy terms.
Yeah, maybe I could just pick up through two examples out to the group of things which are definitely not mainstream now, but maybe in 20 years' time will seem blindingly obvious. So a couple of days ago, I spent some time with someone who works on the idea of the conscious city, rebuilding cities from a mindfulness perspective. It links to one of the organizations I helped set up called Action for Happiness, which was essentially all about applying Buddhist ideas into sort of daily life. Bhutan is now trying to create a mindful city, a sort of opposite to Dubai and Singapore. They may or may not succeed. These ideas are completely opposite to most of what is still happening in urban development. But perhaps that's a space where, again, 20, 30 years' time, this will seem pretty obvious. That's what a good city should look like. It should have places for reflection and silence, many more gardens as well, more joyful spaces. Or another example from New Zealand, where Paul worked, where I was a couple of months ago. It's about 10 years ago, the first country in the world, I think, to give legal personhood to nature. It was a river and a sort of national park, really drawing on Maori ideas about land. It's very much not a kind of Western concept. Is being looked at by many other places in the world who are thinking what actually would happen if we gave, let's say, a legal status, almost sovereignty to nature, seeing it not as a servant of humans, not as natural capital, all these metaphors which are used where nature essentially is a resource for humans, but a completely different way of thinking. Now, maybe those will go nowhere. But it seems to me that's a space where a lot of very radical, bold imagination is happening. And I don't think it's implausible that a generation from now, a lot of that will just seem pretty obvious.
So can I come on the back of the New Zealand example, because Geoff talked about the importance of a sort of Maori worldview, and when I think about the bit of my career in central government, which sometimes felt more fertile in terms of collective imagination, I do think about the time I spent in New Zealand, and it was partly because of the that Maori dimension to policy making, whereby you had this sort of conflict almost between what was quite often an Anglo-Saxon model of government with a set of quite Anglo-Saxon laws, and that was certainly the case in the policy area that I was working on, which was around child protection, youth justice, etc. But increasingly we were encouraged to, and indeed it was an expectation to engage with a Maori worldview and immerse ourselves quite deeply in that, deeply into the language, deeply into the concepts. And you know, as Geoff said, like a lot of indigenous worldviews, there was not that disconnect between people and nature, but a sort of close entangled relationship between the two. And it was the first time, I think, and I'm sort of ashamed to admit it, sort of I would have been about 15 years, certainly over a decade into my senior public policy career at that point, where like some of the things I just took for granted were just questioned. And, you know, things like the degree to which in our concept of policy making within the UK, we focus on the individual principally and the rights of the individual and individuals as the authors of their own life. But actually, that is simply not the case when you get into a Maori worldview. And I'm not going to pretend to be expert in this area, but, you know, things that I just took for granted were questioned, and the importance of whānau, as they call it, which is sort of like family, but importantly, a slightly different concept. So even there, you are having some of your sort of conceptual understandings changed, and networks and what we would call kinship care. It just brought a whole different, and for me, a kind of energetic and vibrant way of thinking about things, which wouldn't have happened without that deliberate and intent of bringing in a different worldview and an expectation that's what we should do. You would start meetings, and this is unthinkable in a world of you know, being on the executive team of, I don't know, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. We would start our executive team meetings with a karakia, which is a sort of Maori prayer. Again, not quite a prayer, not quite the right concept, but to immerse ourselves a bit more into different ways of thinking. And it was a much more enriching and enlivening experience. It didn't mean we got everything right, and there were these really difficult, contested elements between different worldviews colliding. But in itself, that became, at its best, a sort of positive and energizing kind of field. So, you know, we quite often hear about you know, granting rights to the Wanganui River and things like that, and these things have come across the world. But actually, there is within New Zealand government more generally, there is interesting stuff going on by bringing in more indigenous mindsets, which are sort of often go unnoticed, but for me was the most enriching part of working in New Zealand for that period.
And one tiny example of that, we don't want to go off on an entirely New Zealand track, but restorative justice, which I think first came to the UK about 25 years ago, which is an idea with a Maori origin, that you bring, you know, an offender and their victim together to try and, partly for understanding, but also for restoration of the bonds of a community. That's a very powerful idea. And it's pretty mainstream, I think, now in many countries. Not for all of the criminal justice system, but it has its role. And that's just an interesting example. When I think it was first proposed in the UK, it seemed very outlandish. You know, most judges thought this is completely weird, you know, it's never going to work. But it has worked, and it's become, yeah, say, boringly mainstream in some ways.
Amazing. Yeah, I think it's really helpful to hear the sort of big sweep of history in a way, and all of the things that have changed, and the concrete examples are fascinating. I think they really bring it to life. I kind of want to pick up two things that I think have come up in particular, that idea of sort of questioning assumptions and cultures being brought together. I suspect that lots of the people in this room will have found themselves in meetings where they represent one side of a sort of cultural divide. And I think, Geoff, you put it really well, that one of the tasks is not just to develop our ideas and our ways of working, but also to meet people who are different to us. And I just wondered if perhaps both of you could talk a little bit more about spaces where you've seen that happen really well. Paul, you've already spoken to that a little bit, but I feel like as a community, we're really interested in the how things happen, the kind of nuts and bolts of kind of change as it's lived, the sort of messy working things out. So it might be that sort of specific pieces of work or projects come to mind as I say this. Paul, Geoff, if either of you want to jump in on that.
Well, I live in Luton, which is a fairly sort of post-industrial, fairly poor town, which voted for Brexit, doesn't share many cultural assumptions with, I'm in a university at this moment, with the sort of people who go to a university, work in a university. And I think it's really important we bring these different worlds together to have conversations. It's quite hard, and it has to be done always slightly at a tangent. You can't sort of invite people in and say, we want a discussion on the future of society. But this is where the local is a good starting point. What do we want our neighborhood, our street, our town to be 10, 20, 30 years into the future? Everybody can talk about that and be given a bit of license to say what they think and to explore. Similarly, around very specific questions like care, an obsession of mine, because our whole care system is so collapsed at the moment, and it's so obvious we will need a huge amount of imagination and innovation so that by the time I or most of you are in your 80s or 90s, there's actually something to look after us. Again, that brings people in, these quite sort of practical conversations, and probably leave to one side, was it right to have left the European Union? What do you think about the boats crossing the channel? All these things which are very polarizing right now, but just to have an everyday human conversation about the not very distant futures, just 10, 20, 30 years into, that's quite easy to do, and I think really important. But in most towns, those conversations just don't happen. They literally do not happen at all. People just talk to people who essentially share the same beliefs as them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that wholeheartedly. I mean, I think when I look for examples in my own experience of where we've brought different people together, and I could look back on it now, and we wouldn't have called it at the time a sort of collective imagination project. They're actually few and far between in central government, and I think it's much more fertile to look local, as Geoff says. I think, and there's a way of, I think even the phrasing, I mean, the sort of language we are using on this call with a group of sort of relatively like-minded individuals enthused about the concept of collective imagination. I'm not sure it's the language I would choose to use if I was meeting a group of people in Luton or Harpenden, just down the road from Luton, which is where I used to live, which is a very different community. And, but I don't think people will necessarily resonate, and don't think central government resonates with the idea of collective imagination as such. But actually, if you start asking questions which are about collective imagination, the what if questions, I think people do engage with those. I also think people tend to engage better when they feel they're not being asked to design. They're asked for sort of ordinary hopefulness rather than utopianism. I was reading a blog about a conference I wasn't able to attend a couple of weeks ago, the work that's coming out of Gateshead about their liberated model on public services. And they were reflecting back that actually all of the work they're doing with people in their local area seems to boil down to three desires which people have, which is somewhere to somewhere to live, something to do, someone to love. And I thought that was such a beautiful encapsulation of what a lot of people just want from life. And the idea that that is somehow utopian, somewhere to live, something to do, someone to love. That's not a utopian vision. That's a very nice vision and a sort of warming vision. It should be entirely within the gift of an economy and a society as wealthy as ours to deliver this for people. I think engaging people in that sort of level of conversation, those sort of ordinary hopes, as it were, with what if questions, I think it's possible to get people together in quite imaginative ways and thinking in quite imaginative ways, rather than saying we are going to do an exercise in collective imagination, but just bringing people together around these sort of ordinary ideas. feels to me the best bet, and doing that at a more local level.
Yeah. So I don't know, Jake, you want to, in a way, I think it's good to break down the question. There are some bits of this which are really quite boring and technical, like finance. You know, how do you actually have a public finance system, a treasury, which can deal with 10, 20, 30-year time horizons on things like care and education, which I think is incredibly important, but is never going to excite most fellow citizens. The role of law, the German Constitutional Court acted as champion of future generations a couple of years ago. And just last week, the Swiss courts and the European Court have been doing the same. Again, that's not going to excite lots of people, but there's a lot of very interesting questions around law. There's the bureaucratic instantiation of imagination. So some mayors, you know, have teams or even offices. Bologna in Italy has a civic imagination office. The Netherlands is exploring chief exploration officers in departments. So there are lots of examples. But again, this is fairly, you know, a minority interest, but really important for connecting, as it were, the everyday imagination into real impact in the world. I don't know where you want to take the conversation, you know, because there are all these different layers and they're slightly different in nature from each other.
Yeah. I think the thing that strikes me, I'm thinking about the people who might be on this call who may have some practices that help people to imagine collectively and imagine, let's say, outside of the train tracks of the kind of the sort of quote unquote ordinary way of doing things or thinking of things, which might lead to some of the ideas that you're both talking about. And people on the call might be thinking, well, how do I take this practice into those sorts of spaces? How is it that the Swiss court came to that situation? And so it might be, as you say, Geoff, it might be quite different in each of the different spaces. But I think in a way that's what I would love to hear from both of you. I don't mind which spaces you pick, but imagine you're one of the people on this call who are holding this practice and you feel like it's got this great potential for social transformation, if only it could be connected into spaces of power. What advice or recommendations or suggestions would you would you give? What do you think could be helpful in order to get to the sorts of situations that you're talking about?
Well, I mean, the Swiss example last week is quite a weird one, but it was a group of fairly elderly women who took their government to court essentially on the grounds that climate change was harming their human rights. So they'd found a very sort of specific angle, which then opened up a much bigger discussion about the future. And there'll be equivalents in any community, any place. If you have a mayor where you live, I think mayors should be playing an absolutely central role in this work. If you aspire to be the leader of a combined metropolitan authority, say, you should be asking them, what's your 20, 30-year vision? You've got a plan for infrastructure, almost certainly. You'll have sort of planning statements of all kinds, but where's the human bit? Where, what's the vision of, of everyday life or the neighborhood or food in that? And we need to make it much more normal just to be asking those questions. We're in the run-up to a general election. I've never seen at question time and those sort of things anyone ask of a politician, not what are you going to do tomorrow when you're elected, but how does that fit into some vision of where you want to take Britain in the next 20 years? And unless that's coming all the time from people like us on the call, it's not surprising. Everything will be sort of the immediate, the urgent, the narrow, the negative. And this kind of headspace just gets squeezed out, and the media don't bother with it because they don't see much demand from the public. And then I say there are, things like the future of the care system, because so many places are struggling with it. It's so obvious this is going to be a great strategic challenge. That is the kind of thing where maybe you can persuade various centers of power to create commissions, inquiries, but make them quite focused. Don't try and deal with everything, not collective imagination about everything. It's specific, like waste or care or transport. Are the routes in and the more manageable ways of linking into the practicalities of power.
Really
what do you think, Paul?
Yeah, well, again, I agree. I mean, maybe that's the purpose of these conversations. I do agree with what Geoff's saying. I wouldn't surprise people, but I mean, just a couple of reflections to add in. So one of so there's lots in Geoff's book which resonated with me, but one particular line is about the analysts and the dreamers. I think is the way you talk about it. There's almost these sort of two tribes, the analysts and the dreamers, and it's very hard to straddle the two. And I think one of the points you make, Geoff, is there's no sort of word for the people who try and straddle the two anymore. And that really resonated with me because I felt that well, I often feel I'm being asked to make a choice between being an analyst or a dreamer. And actually, those two instincts sit within the James Rowntree Foundation. So we play into, questions about the here and now. We have analysts who are looking at the scale of poverty in the UK right now. And it's important that as a foundation, we can speak to where power is at. So we do have conversations with government ministers, and like other think tanks and analysts, we want to be relevant in those conversations. But I also have a sense that that's not enough. And actually, it's one of the reasons I left government is because I can have those conversations in government, but I wanted to dream a bit. I wanted to be part of collective imagination. And it's not very comfortable being a dreamer in government. It's not really what they value. I mean, Rob Hopkins has this lovely phrase, I don't think it's his originally, about, disimagination machines. And, the civil service sometimes felt like a disimagination machine. When I read about what are the conditions that need to be in order for people to be able to dream and imagine, you can sort of almost read it as a checklist of the opposite of what the civil service can be at times. It's quite sort of disheartening. But equally, when I come out, and that machine, as it were, and the people who are working around SW1, I mean, very, very skeptical about the dreamers. If I try and describe the JRF Emerging Futures program to people I used to work with in Whitehall, they look at me as if I've completely gone doolally, and I'm just, I'm lost to them and the world of policy because I'm starting to dream. But equally, if we engage with the dreamers, there can be a sniffiness back towards the policy world and a sense that, they're just a bunch of analysts tinkering with broken machines. Now, there is a certain truth in that too, but something about trying to build bridges between these communities. So I think it's really important that the community of people here see themselves as part of, to some degree, a single community of people who are interested in taking forward collective imagination, whether they are working in government, where they see themselves as analysts and chiselers, as I've also heard people sort of chiseling away on the inside, or whether they are dreamers and part of collective imagination. It's really important that we have more of a sense of individual community, that we have more people bridging and straddling between those different worlds, because that feels to me something that is missing. And it's something that's really uncomfortable. It's sort of where I feel I am now, because I do still have one foot in the world of government and that sort of analytical framing that goes with government, but I have one foot in a world of dreaming about a better future. And it's actually a very uncomfortable place to be. It's almost though I've lost my sense of identity, because as Geoff says in his book, that isn't an identity anymore. you can be in one or the other, and there's very few people, very few organizations trying to bridge, and it's quite uncomfortable. But for me, it's about slightly reframing your question, Jake. So it's not about how does this community engage with that community. It is a bit more about how do we form a sense that we're all part of a single collective imagination community, wherever we happen to sit, inside or outside of power.
So a proposal, and maybe JRF might do a bit of this, and it's an idea I developed with some colleagues about a year ago. We've got a number of governments, mainly in the developing world, now using this, and was answering this question by building rooms, which have 4 walls. Most rooms have 4 walls. And essentially, you might take something like affordable housing. One wall, you just put all the facts. What are the things you need to know about the trends and the data, blah, blah, blah. You have a second wall, which is the evidence. What do we actually know has really worked or not worked that somebody's tried? A third wall is the innovations. What are the promising ideas, either specific to this or from another field? And the fourth wall is, where do we want to be in 20 years' time? And actually, if you talk to government people, it's kind of obvious you need all 4 dimensions in your mind to make any kind of decision. And it kind of helps to literally embody them on a wall, quite analog. And then have all your meetings, including your ministerial meetings, in the room with those 4 dimensions present. Anyway, that's just one, and it's a very crude way of bridging these different perspectives. I find it a bit more usable. The 3 horizons method I used to really like, but I find it a bit hard to really make useful in a decision-making context. So this four-wall idea, so it's ultra crude, but in a way, no one can argue with it. You know, the policy, it's kind of obvious to the policymakers, you do need all of those four dimensions in your mind before you make a decision. And we don't use, therefore, the language of imagination for the fourth wall. It's more, you know, where will the system be, or in a generation's time?
I love that idea, and if I may, I would like to run an experiment where you have that four-walled room in the way you've set out, Geoff, and you invite ministers and senior civil servants into the room, and they can position their chair anywhere. And I suspect they will position it with their backs to the wall, which is about the 20-year vision, instinctively, because they'll be so focused in the here and now. And part of the challenge for me is like, how do we make them want to turn those chairs round and look more at the 20 years?
Well, the way it works is you before you sit down, you as a group walk round each wall and just discuss a bit. What are the things we really need to keep in our mind of the facts, the evidence, the innovations, and then you sit down and have the meeting. And so it's half standing up, absorbing, and then thinking and deciding. Haven't done it in Britain yet, unfortunately.
This is great. I'm really enjoying how sort of nuts and boltsy we're getting about how to do this. I think this is exactly what we need. I feel like there's so many different directions that we could take this. I'm keen to start bringing in there's actually some excellent questions in the chat from everybody. I'm really here representing the community, really. So maybe we can start picking a few of those. I'll read one out, and then perhaps that gives everybody else a chance to think if there are questions that you'd like to put to Paul and Geoff, and we'll work through those. I mean, the first one, I think it's a really important question. It's David put this forward. It says, how do we avoid, and Geoff, you use the sort of third horizon framework. How do you avoid third horizon ideas and possibilities being co-opted by the status quo, by Horizon 1, where the resources stockpiled, says David, which I think is probably something that lots of us have experienced in different ways. Whether we can stop it happening, I'm not sure exactly, but what are both of your takes on that? And then everybody, if you'd like to add questions, we'll go through extra questions after this one.
Well, I think this is always the discomfort of the activist, and it's been throughout history. Your moment of greatest success will be uncomfortable for you because your idea will be co-opted by big systems, by government, by business. It will be turned into laws. New professions will appear, you know, like equalities and equal rights, or carbon, you know, which is now, you know, embodied in loads of consultancies and accounting systems. And for the activist, that's quite painful, that moment, because what what was free and radical and oppositional has become embedded. Someone else mentioned in the chat, the David Graeber. This was a thing I think he could never get his head around until to the last 6 months of his life. He started realizing maybe I should have realized that the anarchist view is okay up to a point, but if you want change, you have to actually engage with these big systems, which are not where you feel at home. And yet, if you don't, you risk just being a bit irrelevant. That was maybe a provocative answer to the question on the third horizon.
Well, I'm glad Geoff did the provocation, but I mean, I think my instinct is the same, that there is something in that question which speaks to, I think, what I was talking about before, about this oppositional tendency between the dreamers and the analysts. And actually, we need to see ourselves as part of one community. That, you know, the reality is that there are some things that are only ever likely to be delivered by the state in some form. Maybe that's a failure of my imagination not to see beyond that, but that's my starting assumption. When I say the state, I don't necessarily mean central government. It could be a much more devolved and democratically owned state. But the idea that, you know, concepts and dreams somehow lose their purity and their purpose when they are co-opted by the very mechanisms that can make them a reality is something that personally I struggle with. Maybe I struggle with it because I spent 20 years working in that machine, so I can't reconcile that idea with the idea I'm a dream killer. But I think that is that, you know, we have to embrace a degree of messiness in this process. There isn't a pure way of taking an idea or a dream and landing it in the world which does not involve engaging with the status quo in some form and moving that to a different place.
Yeah, I'm sure that that's true, and I'm sure that there are also lots of people on the call who would say that also that governments have been established to maintain certain sort of power dynamics, and that it becomes very messy, and some of the original sort of intention, maybe what David Graeber was so reluctant to let go of, was something quite fundamental that was um hard to let go of, to shift. But I think the messiness feels about right. Hannah, I'm going to ask my colleague Hannah to. Would you like to just put forward a couple of the questions in the chat so we can hear more from the community?
Yes. So we got one from Alex. How can stories and myths of change, regeneration and adaptation inspire to propel a change in worldview? And we sometimes also use the word imaginary instead of worldview in this community.
So I think it's a really good question, because our brains work much more through stories than they do through data and analysis and what have you. So you have to engage with stories. And stories can be very powerful. They can also be deeply dangerous. You know, all around the world are nations stuck in really sort of toxic stories or misleading stories, and so on. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago, because there's a storytelling institute now in London, which has storytelling fellows, and they invited me to go along and talk. And we had a great evening with people from all sorts of backgrounds, from Extinction Rebellion to social change. And I just made one very simple suggestion. There's a much longer piece on it if you're interested, about what might be the architecture of progressive stories now. And I looked at quite a lot of them, and I found they all had this slightly weird sort of dual structure, where on the one hand, they were saying, actually, let's go back to something we've lost, which could be ecological or community or moral, while also going forward to something which doesn't exist yet. That the strong stories are not purely, let's go to this wonderful, sunlit upland of the future, but also had a sense of recovery. And secondly, that all the most powerful stories accepted there probably would be periods of setback and difficulty before we get the rewards. And in a way, it's the story of, some of you will have read Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which Star Wars is based on. And there are lots of these sort of universal stories. In fact, all have this kind of dual structure. They're both going backwards and forwards at the same time. And they always have, setbacks and difficulties and defeats on the road to victory. So my suggestion is, if you're trying to use stories to really engage people and drive social change, they probably need something a little bit like that. If they're just about a lovely utopian future, they're too bland, they're too banal, they don't really engage people. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the one thing I trained in, and the only thing I'm arguably trained in, is I trained in history at university, and so the stories that actually give me most inspiration tend to be historical stories, which is always dangerous. It definitely falls into the danger trap that Geoff's alluding to, and you need to be really careful how we make comparisons. But one of the periods of history that gives me a bit of inspiration at the moment is actually the period in the 1920s, 1930s, and actually a bit earlier than that, within the UK social policy sphere, where I got quite frustrated a few years ago with just constantly hearing it. We need to write a new beverage. We need to write a new beverage, and various people putting up their hands saying I could write a new beverage. And I'm thinking, but that isn't what happened with Beveridge. Actually, Beveridge sat down and wrote his reports at the end of the Beveridge process, as I see it, which a process that took decades of local experimentation, some helpfully supported at the national level and built up over time through national legislation, but a lot of it driven at a local level. And that we mustn't ever assume that the 20s and 30s was a great time to live in the UK, because it absolutely wasn't, for all sorts of reasons. But it does seem to me to be a period of time where there is a story to tell of social policy energy coming from lots of different directions, culminating in what we now know as the Beveridge Report, which sort of pulled it all together. And, I sometimes talk about, I don't think we're in a 1944 moment. I think we're in a 1924 moment right now. The sort of current consensus is falling apart. We don't know what comes next. And the work that we have to do is to build that. And there's no other way of doing it than the hard, messy work of experimentation and trying to build stuff. And of course, the other bit for me, which is important, is that, in the 1920s, nobody had that blueprint. in their head necessarily, or people were not working towards a sort of utopian vision or a blueprint, but they did have a sense of direction and they did have a sense of energy. And if we can recapture some of that, a sense of direction, a sense of energy, you know, I think there's a parallel that we can create to the story of, you know, 100 years ago rather than sort of 80 years ago with beverage. So I take quite a lot of inspiration from that.
Mm.
I think it's so important what Paul just said, because these are quite slow processes, 20, 30, 40 years, and they're very collective processes. It may look like a single individual was the guru of it, but they were a vehicle. They were not the initiator. Beverage certainly wasn't. The same is true of the circular economy, which has been around for 40 years as an idea, all the stuff on zero carbon. They're contributed to by thousands and thousands of people all doing their bit. And then over time, they become a common sense. And I feel we haven't had enough of that work, which is why we don't have the menu of options, why it isn't 1944, 45 yet. But in a way, that's what makes it even more important that we do the hard work now, so that when perhaps the political conditions are right in 5 or 10 years' time, there are good options on the table to then put into effect.
Just a couple of differences now from then, one positive and one negative. The positive is, of course, you know, the technological options available to us are far, far superior than they were 100 years ago. The problem is whenever I talk to people about, you know, maybe we've got 20 years worth of work before someone can sit down and write it, the answer is we haven't got 20 years left. There's an ecological clock ticking now that was not ticking in the same way 100 years ago, or not in a way that they understood. And that is a very uncomfortable caveat to the idea that we've got 20 years worth of work ahead of us. I still think we do, and I still think we need to get on with that work. But in a sense, that's just all the more reason to get on with it with urgency.
Yeah, thank you. Hannah, should we have one more question before we close?
So first of all, Paul and Geoff, thank you very much for answering someone else's question inadvertently just then, talking about taking examples of the past. So Victoria, we got your question already answered in that one, which helped me decide that the next one we'll have is from Caroline. And it's actually about how the sort of the public facing side of this. How do we have better public conversations about imagination beyond preaching to the converts? And Paul, you've touched a little on this already about, you know, what can general public folk respond to as language and invitation. So I'd love to hear a bit more about where you think those spaces are for a public conversation about imagination.
Well, I'll just chip in one thought, which I think one of the biggest barriers to having these conversations with the public is I'm going to refer to a Geoffism again from his book, which is the explorer versus prophet scenario. So what the public, well, I think sometimes what the public wants from its politicians, but I don't actually know what the politicians offer to the public, and that's a different thing, is the prophet. The person who will say, this is my vision for the future, this is what we are going to deliver. To do that with a high degree of certainty, which far surpasses the reality of the certainty they can hold and usually surpasses their ability to deliver. And actually, I would love a conversation which was much more in the explorer territory. I think if you start from the perspective that what we do know is that the current consensus in lots of areas is breaking down, we do know there is a poly crisis we need to address. And none of us knows what the blueprint of the future looks like. No politician does. And I would love it if politicians talk less about their blueprint for the future, actually. I would like to ban the word vision from politicians. You know, I'm sort of happy with politicians having vision, but I think the idea of having a single vision, a blueprint, and a promise of a sort of utopian future is not very helpful. And a bit more humility in taking a public conversation, which this is difficult. You know, we don't know what the answer is. What we want to do is involve more people in experimentation. Certainly the better policy that I was ever involved in Whitehall had that sense of humility, open-endedness, more democratic involvement, more voices, actually put learning rather than impact at the heart of its intention. Didn't get everything right by any stretch of the imagination, but the best work I did in Whitehall always had that. And it was very rare to be allowed by ministers to have that kind of conversation with the public. It was a joy when it happened, because most of the time politicians felt the need to say, we have the answers, we are going to get there in 3 years. we don't need to worry about the 20-year vision. So I think there is an onus on our political dialogue to open more spaces for that kind of humble, open-ended, learning-focused discussion. And I don't think we need to use the term collective imagination outside a group of people who are sort of sold in that. I think we need to be having conversations about hope for people based around that more exploratory sense.
So maybe just two very quick examples which echo what Paul said. So one is Los Angeles, partly prompted by my book. I've been in conversation with the city there, which has a relatively new mayor for whom housing is the top issue. And they're trying to have a collective imagination process about how over the next 20 years can the city deliver affordable housing to people. They definitely don't have the answers, but it will be exploring finance, land, conversion of offices, all 101 things, but essentially saying we need to mobilize the collective intelligence of the city to help solve this problem over the next generation. And for me, the outstanding politician example is FDR, the only American president elected 4 times, who in his inaugural address, when he was elected, said, we've got a huge problem. It's called the Great Depression. We're going to try loads of things. Some of them will fail, but that's what leadership is about. You explore, you energetically try and solve problems. You don't offer a vision of the end point because you don't know, but you work with your society to together solve your problems.
Thank you. So thanks so much. I think we're gonna come to an end here. We're 2 minutes before the end, and I know that Paul and Geoff have both got to rush off after this. But on behalf of the community, a huge thanks to both of you. We've covered such a lot of ground. I think we've got some elements that we can work with. We've heard about a lot of really inspiring examples. I think they really help. Focused inquiries, bridging roles, mayors and local sort of local issues, thinking carefully about our language, banning the word vision, the idea that this is slow and collective, and the idea that we're going to just have to get on with it. So thanks to both of you. We are going to, everybody who wants to can stay on the call. We're going to go into breakout rooms and to just discuss what we've heard. I'm sure lots of this will resonate with what everybody's working on. But just, yeah, if you just join with me today, thank you very much, Geoff and Paul. It's been a really stimulating and fascinating discussion. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye. Thanks.